since we've had lunch, we've gone across the Atlantic Ocean to the southern part of our hemisphere, and we are now going to be looking at the Waldensian settlements in Uruguay and Argentina. Javier Pioli is a student of history. He has done his thesis on Waldensian issues within the church and early on in the 60s and 70s of this previous century. But he also has a love for his church of origin and the church that he serves. And so we're delighted to have Javier Pioli to come and lead us now in a discussion about the church in Uruguay and Argentina. Javier?
Well, to begin with, I would like to express my gratitude to all those who contributed to making this event possible. We are glad to say that since we arrived in Valdese, we felt at home again. Everything was arranged to make us feel comfortable, and every single detail was reminding us of the importance of this celebration. So we bring greetings from all the Waldensian churches in Rio de la Plata, and also from members of Mesa Valdese, that is the Waldensian board. Before leaving Colonia del Sacramento a few days ago, we felt thrilled and a bit concerned about the journey, not knowing how our 2-year-old son would react to this first flight and the shock of a different language. But he's behaving pretty well right now. We try to be open to unexpected situations. But as soon as we reached Valdese, every concern faded. We felt more than welcome, and it is inspiring to see how people in Valdese have joined forces to celebrate this anniversary. Special thanks to Kevin Frederick, Analia Alvarez, and Sheila Young. They helped us and provided all the information we needed. Thanks also to all those who have welcomed us. As you might know, hospitality is part of our Christian and Protestant heritage. In ancient times, hosting a pilgrim was a great honor. But for a pilgrim, finding a safe place to sleep was a matter of life or death. For Waldensians, sharing a meal and receiving someone at home is part of a culture. When I host someone, I am saying, I am glad you're here, I trust you, I care about you. And we appreciate the gesture. So I must also say thanks to Carol and Pascal Williams, who is kindly hosting us in the Pascal house. I came here for the first time in 2009 for a symposium organized by the American Waldensian Society. And I stayed in the very same house. I have wonderful memories of that visit and remember with joy one picture that summarized that experience. Sitting at a round table by the kitchen, there were Rod Mueller and Francis Rivers, Paolo Nasso and former moderator Maria Bonafede from Italy, and then myself, a humble 24-year-old divinity student from South America. And now, almost 10 years after, I have the opportunity to get back to Valdese, stay in the very same house, and share this time with my wife, our little son, and our good friends. I can't be more grateful. Somehow, Valdese and that house are now part of my affective memory. But before talking about the Waldensian settlement in South America, I must say a few words about myself. And I do this because I think that when someone talks about the history of his community, family, country, or church, that person is deeply committed to what it is saying. When someone shares a story, that someone is obliquely talking about himself. And although we try to be objective, we will emphasize the parts of the story that we consider meaningful for our present. That is why I will take some minutes to talk about myself. And I'm sorry about that, but I have to. As you may have suspected, my last name doesn't sound like part of the Waldensian heritage. In fact, the Pioli family did not come from this Valdese in Piedmont, nor did they settle in any Waldensian colony. They moved to Uruguay by the mid-19th century, and they might have shared the ship with some of the first Waldensian families that settled in Uruguay and Argentina. Assuming that they truly traveled in the same vessel and departed from the very same harbor, they had very little in common. Once, the Piolis were from Tuscany, Roman Catholics who had Italian as their mother tongue. Others were from Piedmont, Protestants who could speak Italian or French but preferred another language to talk at home. It sounds like a distorted French to me, would possibly say one of my Tuscan ancestors. Both groups established in Uruguay, the Waldensians formed their own colonies to the west of the country, and these Tuscans were among the first settlers of an isolated land far away to the east coast. By the year 1880, there were just a few houses there and lighthouse, erected in a hostile seashore surrounded by miles of sand dunes. 4 generations later, a Waldensian woman was introduced in a party to a descendant of those Tuscan immigrants, a man who had moved recently to Colonia City due to work reasons. They dated, married, and finally had children. And here's when I show up in the story. I was raised in an interdenominational family where heritage and religious identity were not as strict as it used to be 50 years before. My generation grew up in a world in which people are not so attached to family prescriptions and can choose more freely. Plus, it is a world where you know that there are options. In fact, during my childhood and teenage years, I was sent to a Roman Catholic school and then to a public high school. I attended Christmas parties in the Waldensian church or went to Holy Mass when we visited my father's relatives. My mother taught me to pray on the Protestant style, and my grandfather used to talk about the first Waldensian man in Uruguay, and he was pretty boring. And my paternal grandmother used to send us nice books with tales of Jesus, edited obviously by a Catholic publishing house. I had friends in high school that attended a Baptist church, and I was sometimes invited to their place. I could discuss freely with relatives and friends who considered themselves atheists, agnostics, or who just weren't sure about faith matters. What I'm trying to say here is that nowadays going to church, supporting a special party, or pursuing a career is not so predetermined. It is not decided in advance whether you are going to become a lawyer, a member of the Methodist Church, or a supporter of an ecologist party. We can be influenced by our family, but there will not be so much pressure as it used to be. We make our choices. That happened to me when I was a teenager, and I got involved in a Waldensian church in Montevideo. I really enjoyed that time, and it helped me to overcome some family hardships. Mabel Gonet, who is right now with us, was one of the leaders in that youth group where I got involved, and I met wonderful people there, many of whom are still good friends. And Alia, for example, who is also here. And that was the moment when I realized that I wanted to be Waldensian. Not only because of my heritage, but because I shared with my peers a way of thinking, of celebrating, of talking about faith. And I decided to be Waldensian because I felt part of a community, a real church. And I am glad to say that many other people joined the Waldensian church for the same reasons. After that, I studied divinity in a Protestant university known as ISEDET. And Janina, my partner, she also grew up in an interdenominational family. And we believe that our little son, Dante, will make his own choices someday. This is a very short story, my personal story, and I wanted to tell it first because I will talk about Waldensians in Rio de la Plata, and I am deeply committed with that history. I cannot be objective in the way I look at it because I feel part of it. I can only give you a glimpse of what I consider a rich, thrilling, and sometimes even controversial history. Perhaps you will find that we have many things in common. Like many Waldensian colonies in the United States, there were settlements in South America that did not prosper, where Waldensians suffered the lack of resources, harassment, the threat of diseases, flooding, droughts, and wild animals. In some cases, there were also quarrels and disagreements. In fact, I would say that every Waldensian settlement in this region passed through some of these hardships. In Uruguay and Argentina, the Waldensian presence and the organization of its first settlements can be traced back to the mid-19th century. Actually, no one would imagine that any Protestant colony would be admitted in Rio de la Plata when the region was under the Spanish rule, the Spanish Catholic rule. After the Independence Revolution of 1810, the region went through a period of instability, with violent political struggles and economic stagnation, plus the persistent interference of Brazil, Great Britain, and France in local issues. For that reason, until 1851, this region was not a very interesting place to settle down. My grandfather always says, with pride, that he is related to the first Valdensian man in Rio de la Plata. His name was Jean-Pierre Planchon, or Juan Pedro Planchon would be in Spanish, and his biography depicts the image of a lonely adventurer, a Waldensian from Vilar Pellice, who left home not knowing for sure where he was going. We assume that he did not leave his parents and brothers just for the sake of fun, but mainly because living conditions in the Waldensian valleys were getting worse and worse. In fact, by 1850, Waldensians in Piedmont were free to travel, take a course of studies, or buy their own land. But in their valleys, they were dealing with severe adversities. The villages were overcrowded, and the land was scarce. The last crops had been very bad, and weather conditions were not very promising. To depict the population growth and the difficult life conditions in the Waldensian valleys, the Uruguayan historian Roger J. Monat quotes a letter written in 1854 by Reverend Appia. So says Reverend Appia. The misery here is frightening. Most families are ruined. Many of them have 6, 8, even 10 children. All of them at home, not knowing what they would eat tomorrow. People will be starving in Rocapiata as well as in Prat del Torno. This is the 4th grape harvest that fails, and that is the only income of this parish church. As we can see, the Waldensian valleys by the mid-19th century were crowded, due to an increase in the birth rates and a slight improvement in sanitary conditions. However, the narrow valleys could not offer enough land to sustain the population, and a string of bad harvests led to starvation and even social disorder. Due to these hardships, many people were leaving the valleys in search of work abroad, and many of them were finding a new place in southern France, for example. But population growth and living conditions didn't change for better, hence the exodus continued. After 1848, the restrictions that had oppressed Waldensians for generations were finally lifted. Now, purchasing new lands in the rest of the reign became a possibility. But most Waldensians were not wealthy enough to afford that. Migration, however, had many historical precedents. What's more, The New World looked like a land of opportunities, especially for those who were part of a large and poor family. This was probably Jean-Pierre Planchon's background when he left Villers-Pellice and headed for Marseilles some year before 1852. By that time, the village was overcrowded, holding about 3,000 people. He leaves behind his family, then travels from Marseilles to Montevideo, where he arrives after a long journey. He was 24 years old, and as most newcomers, he found his first job near the harbor. In the letters that he writes to his older brothers, Jean-Pierre holds a positive perception of the country. He says that he's working in a confectionery and invites them to migrate. A few years after that, Jean-Pierre's brothers and other Waldensian families are now established in Uruguay, starting up their farms. They send letters to their friends and relatives describing the country as a peaceful land with kind neighbors, pleasant weather, and rich soil. I can tell you that if you read those letters, they will sound good. It looks like the best of both worlds, but there is something that just doesn't fit. José Pedro Barran was a Uruguayan historian who studied thoroughly the culture and social life of the country from its very beginning. Through his investigation and analyzing the political history of that region, we can prove that neither Montevideo nor the rest of the country were such a peaceful and pleasant place to live, at least not until 1880. Now, we will try to depict a historical landscape of the time Jean-Pierre Planchon arrived to this region. According to Barran, before the year 1860, there were no bridges or railroads in the countryside, and during winter it was hard to negotiate a river. In fact, swollen streams and rivers were part of the winter panorama. It was quite impossible to travel in cart or caravan during rainy days, and trying to cross a fast-flowing river was too dangerous, because horses could easily lose their grip. Therefore, bad weather conditions and the lack of proper roads left many villages and ranches isolated for weeks. Another problem in the countryside was its depopulation, caused by the frequent political revolts, bad living conditions, and the scourge of criminal bands. There were only a few village-like towns scattered throughout the country. These urban settlements were surrounded by some acres of cultivated land, and beyond that you would see a wild natural landscape. Usually, wild nature in Rio de la Plata was considered overwhelming and dangerous. For example, in the year 1850, in Colonia Department, wild dogs were such a threat for travelers and ranchers that 3,000 of these beasts were captured and had to be put down. But if you still trust Planchon's letters and expect Montevideo to be a neat city, the information we have of these years might let you down. This area was better controlled than other regions, since the national government, foreign embassies, and the troop headquarters were established there. However, by the mid-19th century, the capital city was a rather messy place. In 1852, or maybe 1853, Jean-Pierre Planchon arrives to a city that holds 34,000 inhabitants. A 10-year civil war known as Guerra Grande had just finished, and both Argentina and Uruguay were overcoming the hardships of stagnation and political resentments. The city was settled on a large cape or peninsula over the mouth of the Montevideo Bay. But the city was not an urban setting with neat roads, drainage ditches, sanitation facilities, parks and pedestrian walkways. In Europe, cities like Paris, London, Berlin, and even Turin were being redefined according to the principles of modern urbanism. But here that novelty would arrive by the end of the century. So what these first settlers found in Uruguay was rather like that in the countryside, or a little bit better in Montevideo, but rather a messy place. As a matter of fact, the scene that Jean-Pierre Planchon might have witnessed in 1852 was a curious urban setting, a place where the architecture of a colonial city and the European culture got mixed with the customs and the roughness of daily life in the countryside. In Montevideo, urban and rural dimensions coexisted, creating a singular environment. According to Barran, as soon as you leave the city and walk through the roads, you would see nothing but thistles, tall pastures, and pathless marshes. But the interesting thing is that inside the city, you could see herds of pigs wandering around, also cows and hens, and it was a 34,000 inhabitant city. In that time, you could smell a particularly and sometimes even suffocating stench. In Montevideo, there were still dairies and cow barns, dog corpses lied in public spaces for days, the spoiled meat was left in the streets, burials were practiced within the city limits, and even people defecated or dumped their ordure in the public road. That happened because the city was growing, but many people behaved as if they were living in a small farming village. So during the mid-19th century, many European visitors and diplomatic envoys pointed out that daily life in Rio de la Plata was barbaric and uncivilized. In fact, uprisings, boycotts, magnicides, and slaughters were part of political life for decades. And Waldensians also had to deal with it. For example, on January the 29th, 1858, a third group of Waldensians arrived in Montevideo. There were 136 immigrants from the Valdese Valley on board of the vessel Edel. They were eager to land, contact their friends and relatives that were living near Florida City, travel there, purchase or lease some fields and establish. They were impelled by all the letters, all the nice letters sent by the first settlers. But as soon as the vessel tied up alongside the quay, everybody noticed a tense situation in the city. A new uprising against the national government had begun. So in December 1857, rebel insurrection had started along the countryside. Frederick Snow Pendleton, who was a consular chaplain to the British residents at Montevideo, was in good relations with the Valdensian families established near Florida. Having heard about the arrival of this third group, he met them in Montevideo and advised not to leave the city until the government had suffocated the revolt. They did so, and after a week, the uprising was under control. Brutally, the surrendered rebels were slaughtered in an event called Masacre de Quinteros. So, when this third group of Waldensian immigrants started to move in carts to the fields of Florida, they became more aware of the real situation in the countryside. To make matters worse, one of the immigrants, and this is, for me, it's a rather funny story, he was called Paul Garrick. He had the naive idea of taking some distance from the caravan and go hunting to the woods by himself. There, he came across some gauchos and thieves who stole his cape, cloak, and shotgun. Apparently, this Paul Garrick was angry from the moment he was stolen to the moment he arrived in Florida. And the first thing he said to the settlers in Florida was to insult them, because he was really enraged. Apparently, people were not as nice and pleasant as it was described in the letters. But was daily life during the mid-19th century really barbaric and uncivilized in that region? Were the European visitors, diplomatic envoys, and the local most remarkable men right when they say that this was a reckless society? They blamed indigenous, gauchos, mestizos, rural leaders, and even the traditional political parties for all the brutality of civil wars. José Pedro Varela, a journalist and politician, he complained in 1876 about what he considered a constant state of war. He said, "After half a century of independent life, this republic has not experienced 10 years of peace. And what kind of peace? A peace full of mistrust, agitated and sick. What's more, it is a peace that does not prevail and lasts a few months, maybe 1 or 2 years. After all, in these 45 years, we had 18 revolutions. Therefore, it can be said without exaggeration that war is the normal state of this republic." On the other shore of the river, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, president of Argentina and a well-known writer, was even more racist than elitist. He stated that Argentina was in the crossroads of an antinomy. It had to be chosen whether to follow the path of barbarism or the path of civilization. For him, everything was quite clear, and the way to progress, long-lasting and peace and modernization was only possible if the European culture prevailed. According to his beliefs, indigenous people and gauchos had to be exterminated because they were an obstacle for real improvements. About gauchos, he said that their blood was a worthless sign of their humanity, more useful as a fertilizer than running in their veins. And about indigenous people, he also spoke mercilessly. The symbolic opposition between civilization and barbarism was not only Sarmiento's principal thesis, but also a persistent idea along the 19th century. This antinomy was used to sustain the annihilation of indigenous and gauchos, and politicians used it as a leitmotif that justified military campaigns, slaughters, and merciless criminal policies. The main idea was that the state was the safeguard of the republic, and therefore of civilization and progress. So all those who refused to submit to that power would be considered barbaric and rebellious. That antinomy became very useful during the 19th century because it conferred authority to the state. In that line of thinking, whilst the indigenous and gauchos were rejected, the new states welcomed European migrants who would fill the empty spaces. So both countries, Argentina and Uruguay, tried to attract European settlers because they were considered more industrious and because they would accept to establish in the borderlands, in isolated places, or even in lands that were still under indigenous control. This theory explains pretty well why in Argentina, the Waldensian colonies were located in northern Santa Fe, over the Paraná River, and in the edge of the semi-arid Pampas. Those territories were, by the end of the 19th century, isolated places where weather conditions, wild animals, and indigenous population were still a threat. In Uruguay, instead, most agricultural Waldensian colonies were located in strategic points where the presence of immigrants would boost economic development and prevent the eruption of new revolts. So in a certain sense, we could say that Waldensian immigrants in some regions fulfilled the role of a pioneer. I would say more or less like Waldensian immigrants in Valdese. Now, I must turn back to the unanswered question. Was daily life during the mid-19th century really barbaric and uncivilized in that region? Were those intellectuals who say that our society was struggling between civilization and barbarism right? I would not be so drastic. Considering the wide historical context, the 19th century in South America was a moment of profound transformations. Since 1810, a political revolution led to independence and great changes, The former colonial society was eroded and crumbled. The political institutions of the Ancien regime and its colonies shattered into several splinters. A new order was born, but it took many years to reach its definite shape. So it took us many generations to consolidate our political institutions and define a true democracy. But what happened during the mid-19th century doesn't mean that we were in a barbaric stage of social development. I would rather say that those European visitors and illustrated men who complained about the constant state of war were actually witnessing a society in transition. And at that very moment, whilst the region was still in the middle of political struggles, Waldensians showed up. When we look at a family photo, the picture itself doesn't mean anything. But as soon as we see it, lots of memories come to our minds. If that picture recalls happy memories, we will say that it is a nice photograph. Instead, if the picture reminds me of a difficult stage of my life, I might say that it is not a nice image. My father used to paint a lot. And when I was 3 years old, he took a photograph of me and used it as a reference to paint on canvas. The painting was finished, and I was there sitting on a bed, half awake, disheveled, yawning with my eyes half shut, during a sunny Sunday morning. The painting looks great to me, but my wife doesn't have the same opinion. I like it because it reminds me of my childhood, of those wonderful weekends spent at home with my parents, when I was still the only kid in the family and I was drawing all the attention. But Janina thinks that the painting is simply awful. I sometimes say that I want to hang it on a wall at home, but I say that only because it is funny to make her lose her temper. And I am telling this story because I think that first Valdensians in Rio de la Plata also had different interpretations of their present. They didn't have any pictures to share, but they used to write down their memories and send letters to their families and friends showing their own perception. In fact, what others read in those letters was not an objective picture of real life in Rio de la Plata, but just one possible interpretation. And in most cases, first Valdensian settlers tended to look on the bright side when talking about their lives. For example, in the letters written by pioneers Jean-Pierre Baridon and Joseph Planchon, their farms near Florida looked like the promised land. So says Baridon in one of his first letters. This country can be compared to the promised land, of which the holy writers have taught. The place is plenty of natural riches, flocks of sheep, many horses, and an amazing number of cows graze on its prairies. There are birds of any kind, deers, ostriches, and quails can be easily hunted. Come on over, we will be waiting for you with a fatted calf, the bread and the salt of hospitality. On another letter dated April the 5th, 1857, Baridon says that he wouldn't change a small field in Uruguay for the best farm in Vilar Pellice. He was part of the group, of the first group that left the Valdese. It was perhaps the group that decided to migrate after receiving Jean-Pierre Planchon's letters. And Baridon's description is also so optimistic that it will encourage others to do the same journey. He probably exaggerated when he said that on an already mowed field they collected enough wheat to live for a year. And he might have exaggerated when he said that onions were as big as human heads. My wife is an agronomist, so I asked her if onions could be that size, and she said no, in Uruguay you couldn't get an onion that size, so he's a liar. Really, his description makes me remind of Old Testament, of a funny blending of the Promised Land and Garden of Eden. He alludes to a place where you practically wouldn't suffer starvation, pain, or any kind of sickness. I think that if this Baridon were alive right now, he would be working for an advertising agency. But the most interesting thing about Baridon's depiction of life in Uruguay is that he was talking about a healthy country, whilst in Montevideo, more than 2,000 people were dying of yellow fever. Here's the paradox. The epidemic had begun at the end of February in 1857, so when Baridon was writing his letters, he knew that the epidemic was there. Still, he said that Uruguay was a healthy country. As Florida was pretty close to Montevideo, bad news must have reached the town early. But the lack of information related to the illness and how to prevent it led to a state of fright and bewilderment. So local authorities were aware of the danger, but they didn't know for sure how to stop the spreading. I wanted to say something about yellow fever, but we were going to go to a picture that was painted by Blanes, that was a 19th century painter, Uruguayan painter. He painted Un episodio de la fiebre amarilla en Buenos Aires. That painting was composed by Blanes, Juan Manuel Blanes, in 1871, depicting the yellow fever epidemic in Buenos Aires. It shows two doctors in their visit to a family that had been recently infected. In the painting, Blanes recreates a small and shadowy room on a tenement house where we become witnesses of a sorrowful event. The scene seems to be motionless, as if the sequence had frozen when the dead bodies were discovered by the visitors. They are standing on the threshold of the door, watching respectfully the body of the dead woman, while a baby cuddles against her, stroking her breast. Apparently, the second corpse had not been noticed yet, and it lies behind the door in the bed. One of the most impressive details of the painting is the lack of vivid colors, which creates a dreadful atmosphere. Blanes was inspired to do this painting. He was inspired by a notice on newspaper talking about a woman called Anna Princitiani, who was an Italian immigrant who was living in Buenos Aires, and she got yellow fever and he died. So after that news, Blanes painted that painting. So, as we can see, epidemics were one of the greatest fears. Usually, immigrants who established in the cities were part of the most vulnerable groups. They lived near the harbor in tenement houses called conventicios, with poor sanitary conditions and limited access to fresh food and drinking water. That was the case of that Italian immigrant. However, Waldensians settled in the countryside, so epidemics were not as common as they were in the city. But that doesn't mean that Waldensians were immune to the disease or that they were completely unaware of the different epidemic outbreaks. In conclusion, it will be naive to think that this Baridon didn't know of the dangers of epidemics and violence in the country. Perhaps he exaggerated or decided to look on the bright side, because real living conditions were not as good as they were described. But this distorted depiction of reality was not a malicious lie. Actually, his description makes sense if we consider the hardships that these settlers had faced before. And we can also understand his depiction of reality if we understand how lonely they were feeling in the countryside. So he was looking at the bright side, but because maybe unconsciously or consciously, those first Waldensian settlers wanted their parents and relatives and friends to move to Uruguay and Argentina. I have tried to translate here a letter written by a Valdesian pastor in Genoa, who wrote to his peer in the Valdese, describing the farewell to a Valdensian group who left towards Montevideo in 1857. He says that most of them cried. The families from Villar asked me to tell you that they were living in peace and gratitude towards all brothers and sisters of their congregation. They told me, those Valdensians who were living, that if they had offended anyone or if they had been any kind of offense against them, they would surely forget it and expected their brothers and sisters from Villar to do likewise. It was, in this case, a last farewell, to never come back. This was the same group that reached Montevideo when the yellow fever was desolating the city, so the cultural impact might have been even hard. As migrating was not like walking in a park, they experienced it as a distressing and traumatic exodus. And once they settled in Florida, missing their valleys was part of the migration trauma. Perhaps for that reason, Valdensian immigrants wrote so many letters telling their friends and relatives about the good soil. So we can say that at first the Valdensian immigration into Uruguay and Argentina was also lived like an exile. It was either the promised land or the Babylonian exile. In some ways, they thought of these fields like the promised land because of its economic opportunities, but culturally, they felt isolated. Also, in the very beginning of a long-lasting drought and the lack of resources were critical. So, in a chronicle, it was stated that in Florida City, near Florida City, Valdensian women used to cry and mourn, and if they had the opportunity to get back to their valleys, no one would have rest in those fields. Somehow that chronicle, that description, recalls the first versicle of Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Jean-Pierre Baridon did his best to organize the religious life, but the situation in Florida was hard, since families lived in very separate fields, so they had to move. The Valdensian settlement in Florida failed, but thanks to Reverend Pendleton and the families could find a better place to settle in Colonia Department. The place was first called Colonia del Rosario Oriental. It's the same place where now are the cities of Colonia Valdense and La Paz, Colonia Piemontesa. After the first settlement, several waves of Valdensians coming from the Valdensian valleys got into that colony, and it is nowadays it's still maybe the bigger Valdensian settlement in Uruguay and Argentina. But the history of the Valdensian migration to Rio de la Plata during the 19th century is a sequence of hesitation, struggles, and misunderstandings. First of all, it was not a planned migration because the project of creating colonies in Argentina or the United States never reached the Valdensian Senate's approval. So Valdensians moved to Uruguay and Argentina just by themselves. Then, spontaneously and by their own means, the first waves of Valdensian migrants got to Uruguay and then to Argentina. As soon as Valdensians reached these countries, they got involved in a few struggles and misunderstandings. In Florida and Montevideo, Jean-Pierre Planchon and Jean-Pierre Baridon were natural leaders. Baridon helped to organize the community and its religious life. He maintained regular correspondence with the valleys and was an outstanding delegate of the settlers, maintaining good relations with local authorities. When he met Reverend Pendleton, they got on well, and Pendleton helped the Valdensians to overcome harassment and the hostile attitude of a Catholic priest. Pendleton helped them to find a new place. He made the arrangements with shareholders of the Sociedad Agrícola del Rosario Oriental to purchase fields and settle there a new colony. That's Colonia Valdense. He even went to Torre Pellicci and begged for a Valdensian pastor. But when Waldensians settled in that place, new problems showed up. Pendleton represented the interests of the British government and had his own projects with Waldensians, so sooner or later, that would lead to a conflict. In fact, Waldensian board reports of 1867 and 1868 show that they had lost contact with this Reverend Pendleton after many misunderstandings, and that he still had funds that belonged to the colony. Besides, Waldensians also had their own internal struggles. First Pastor Morel couldn't deal with the ill wills and misunderstandings, and he finally retired. And after him, it came Pastor Michelin Salomon, who after that he moved to the United States. One interesting thing about the group that followed Reverend Michelin Salomon to the United States was that many of those families had relatives who decided to stay in Uruguay. Among the Lauterets, the Planchons, the Courdins, and the Pontets that established in Barry County, Missouri, there were brothers, sons, or maybe cousins who stayed in South America. For example, there was one brother of Jean-Pierre Planchon, two brothers of Jean-Pierre Planchon who decided to stay in Uruguay. Jean-Pierre Planchon and his wife got into the United States and they lost contact. Many generations have passed. I am a descendant of Etienne Planchon, Jean-Pierre Planchon's brother, and I wondered what happened with that branch of my family that I never met. And what would have happened if they had stayed. I know that Jean-Pierre Planchon and his family settled in Missouri, that they were part of the Waldensian Presbyterian Church in Monet, but I don't really know what happened after that. It makes me curious. But, well, time is running, so I will move to the year 1958. We're going to give a jump forward. That year, the Miguel Morel publishing agency and bookstore announces the release of History of the South American Waldensian Colonies in their First Century. The book was written by Reverends Ernesto Tron and Emilio Gantz, and it shows a summarized history, perhaps the first systematic history of Waldensians in this region. The book was part of a well-planned campaign to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Waldensian Church in South America. After 100 years, Waldensians had got through different stages, and during the mid-20th century, they were a thriving church. So in 1958, there was much to celebrate. Waldensians had founded about 19 churches, and many of them were still the center of flourishing colonies. And there were also many Waldensians who were moving to bigger cities, such as Buenos Aires, Bahia Blanca, or Montevideo. In 1958, Waldensians were also celebrating many achievements in the field of education. Since the very beginning of each settlement, a priority was to erect a building that could serve the religious and educational needs of the colony. In many colonies, the first solid buildings were both schools and sanctuaries, where children attended daily lessons while worship services were held weekly. In 1958, Waldensians were also celebrating the 17th anniversary of Liceo Daniel Armand Dugon, the first high school erected outside Montevideo City. Its courses started in 1888, and that institution was very important for many local residents because it bridged the gap between the primary school and the access to higher studies. Waldensians also got engaged in what we call escuelas del hogar, the household schools. These are some photos from the household schools in 1918. That institution was created in 1918 by Ana Armand Dugon with the aim of teaching young girls how to prepare meals, preserve food, or how to plan a household economy. In its time, it was a revolutionary project. And nowadays, it still exists, but offering both to boys and girls, teenagers and adults, courses on bakery, household economy, dressmaking, handicrafts, and many foreign languages. And actually, Teenagers who go to the household schools are not dressing like that right now, fortunately. But trying to summarize the different moments of the Waldensian Church during its first centenary, I will recall the historic periodizations suggested by historian Roger J. Monat. He states that the Waldensian history can be, the first 100 years, can be separated into 4 different stages. The first one is the stage related to hardships and struggles. The second stage is the time of welfare and expansion, when most agricultural colonies settled. The third stage is the time of the cultural adjustment, when Waldensians learn to speak in Spanish and they become part of social life. And the fourth stage is the time of the assimilation process, when most Waldensians moved to cities and towns. So, during the 50s in towns and cities, you will find Waldensians working as lawyers, physicians, nurses, teachers, social assistants, merchants, office clerks, and also many workers in different branches of the industry. From now on, Waldensians will not be considered only a group that lives within the borders of a colony. The traditional Waldensian patterns have changed. So to conclude, if this were a self-complacent history of the Waldensian churches, I would have jumped forward to the times of prosperity. Or I would have simply talked about the most prominent families that established in Rio de la Plata. But I am more interested in showing a history where hesitations, struggles, and misunderstandings are also part of life in a community, and even part of a normal church. I am sure that if we transmit a history that hides human conflicts, inconsistencies, and hardships, our children will tend to think that their present is incomplete, unsatisfying, or worthless, because the past was wonderful. I think that if we insist on saying that our past was great and that our ancestors were righteous and truthful all the time, then we will tend to hide our own faults and weaknesses instead of trying to learn from them. So we must embrace a human history in which we can learn from hardships and mistakes, a history in which all dimensions of our existence are considered. That's the only way we can accept our human condition. Because I believe in the God of history, I truly believe that He wants us to learn also from our mistakes, our struggles, our failures, and our contradictions. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Yes.
Javier, thank you very much for your speech. Can you give us an explanation of the title Imagine you gave? Now, the first and the last one.
You mean...
the first picture and the last one.
Okay. Do you want to know who made it?
Yeah, and what
does it mean?
Perhaps it's a siesta tiness, but yeah, you should choose this and why.
Well, that picture was drawn by a Valdensian young man. He might be 25 or 24 years old. It's not a big deal, actually. He drew that picture to depict the way he considered the Valdensian church in Rio de la Plata, the way he thought of the Valdensian church in Rio de la Plata. His idea was that although there's a river that separates both borders of both countries, Valdensians are very connected. And that picture will be on Página Valdese. It's our newspaper, our journal. It was part of Página Valdese back in May 2018, I think.
Javier, as I reflect upon not only the condition of the church in North America, we've mentioned briefly some of the issues facing the current church in Europe and in South America. In a culture where Uruguay is perceived geographically and culturally as the most, the least religious culture, or perhaps the most secular culture in South America. And yet you have embraced the faith for yourself. And what are you seeing from young adults? What are your hopes for the future of the church's ability to draw new young adults and new people into the life of the church? What are your hopes there?
Well, most scholars in Uruguay would say, many people would say that the secularization process in Uruguay started very early. So the separation between state and the Roman Catholic Church was at the very beginning of the 20th century was a fact. But we wouldn't say that Uruguayan people are not religious people. They are very proud of the religion, the state religion, the civic idea of being part of our same country. But there are many phenomena in the Uruguay related to religious for example, evangelist churches and Pentecostal churches are growing bigger and bigger in Uruguay. And they are very charismatic churches. Although the Roman Catholic Church is losing, I think it's losing membership and power, but the religious identity of Uruguayan people, I think they have a religious, they are a religious people, not so related with religion as an institution. But in this soccer World Cup, many Uruguayans will be praying, so they will discover their spirituality when talking about soccer.
Anyone else? Yes.
Why didn't they just go back? I mean, I know that sounds awful. My dad came from Sweden. My dad came from Sweden because there was no more land to work and things were getting bad. And I always used to ask him, if things got bad here, why didn't you go back? And I'm sorry that sounds so ugly, but it sounded like things were really bad in Uruguay as well. What kept him there?
What happened?
What kept the Waldensians in South America?
Do you hear me? Yep. Okay. I think that one of it could be explainable for Waldensians in Uruguay were not wealthy. Were not the wealthy Waldensians who left the Waldensian valleys. Actually, Waldensians in the Waldensian valleys were never wealthy. But those groups knew that if they left the Waldensian valleys, they would never come back because they wouldn't have enough money to go back. Or even they have sold their land, their fields in the Waldensian valleys. So it's a travel to never come back. Some Waldensians had the opportunity to get back to the Waldensian valleys, or maybe even to come here to the United States, but it was not easy at that time to gather the whole family with small children to have a 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks journey on a vessel. So many of them complained about being in Uruguay or in Argentina, but didn't have enough money or they were not strong enough to travel again. It was a very stressing experience. traveling by vessel in the 19th century. Many Waldensians who settled in Uruguay and Argentina during the 20th century, for example, Waldensians who left the Valdese during the the Second World War, they settled, for example, in Colonia Valdense, and then whenever they wanted, they got back to the Valdensian valleys, because the economic situation and technology allowed those Waldensians to go back to the valleys. You're welcome.
Maybe you're going to talk about this after the break, but I'm curious as to where new Waldensian pastors get their theological education now. You said you went to Izadet,
Yeah.
but in the wake of its closing, what are people doing?
Well, now this is this is the struggle of the century, because Waldensians used to study theology in Buenos Aires, both in a university called FET, that is Facultad Evangélica de Teología. That after a few years it became ISEDET when they joined the Lutheran Church. It was an ecumenical university. It closed, I think, on January 2016, a year and a half after I graduated. And Waldensian Church is now engaged in a new project of theological education that now that project involves only online education. Can it be said? Online education. But the idea is to develop a new university someday. This project is called RET. It's R-E-E-T. Red Ecuménica de Educación Teológica. And there are many churches, the Lutheran Church, the Waldensian Church, the German Lutheran Church in Rio de la Plata, and others more. And we hope it will be different from ISEDET. It will be a new thing, and that it will be an interesting place, not only for pastors, but for lay people to study.
Javier, I want to turn back a moment to the first generations. If in Uruguay and Argentina, Waldensians are remembered as as a group of immigrants, what would the society and the churches say today? What was their contribution to the construction of the nowadays society?
Yeah. I could partly answer that question on the second presentations. I will try to shorten it a little bit. But in Uruguay and Argentina, Waldensians contributed to society, mostly in educational matters. Well, the first high school was settled by Waldensians in Uruguay, the first high school in the countryside, but also in Argentina, Waldensians were deeply concerned about education of their children. And even Waldensian women in Argentina and Uruguay were able to study much more and much better than other women in the Uruguay and Argentina. For example, I will say it later, but Reverend Daniel Armando Gon had, I think he had 6 sons and 7 daughters, and all his daughters became professionals. They were physicians, they were chemists, they were teachers, and then through their studies they became well-known people. And they were recognized in society because, for example, these Waldensian doctors were engaged into fight against tuberculosis and pediatricians, and so on. And Another thing that I think was a contribution from Waldensians to Argentine and the Uruguayan society is the idea of being a minority in a country where most people belong to the Roman Catholic Church. So just speaking out loud and saying, I am a minority here, makes a contribution to our society to realize that we are not a homogeneous society and people can be different and have different options. But we will talk about that next 45 minutes.
With that, let's go ahead and take our break now, and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes.